All right, sorry about the late start. So we're just going to jump right into this. And is Alexander in here, the one that's speaking right after me? I'm curious. No? All right, so when 11:40 rolls around, give me a signal so I could wrap this up. Because we're starting a little late and it kind of goes a little long to begin with. So overall, this is the .NET Developer Overview of nopCommerce from 0 to 60. How many out there are certified or kind of live, eat, and breathe the nopCommerce source code in general? I'm just curious. Okay, so after this talk, I'd really like to hear your, your suggestions on different aspects that might be best to highlight. But this is really an overview for a .NET developer. So let's say you brought a .NET developer on your team. This could be some like onboarding kind of documentation that you could share with them so they can get up to speed and apply their .NET development background to what nopCommerce is. So let's just go ahead and kind of hop right into it. So I'll kind of show you a bit of the approach, how I'm going to do the walkthrough, but this is going to be a lot of code being shown. So we're going to start from the front end, work through how business logic is being handled, as well as how the data access layer is. I'm going to touch on extensibility a little bit, and if there's time, I'll even cover some of the test coverage. And in summary, where to get this presentation, my email address was on the first slide. It'll be on the last slide as well. So any of this content, the slides, a PDF of this, it's also out on YouTube as well. Email me. That's my best way of getting you this content. So sit back and enjoy. There's a lot that's going to be thrown at you. So we're really just going to walk through the code base itself. So there's that 0. I'm assuming you know .NET or are comfortable reading C# code with this audience. I'm pretty sure we have that. And we're going to walk through the front end of Nop Web as well as its common framework and Nop Web framework. Touch on a little bit of the admin piece of it. Then we're going to look at a little of the common code, Nop Core. We'll go into the services layer, which nopCommerce itself, it's a one install. It's not a multi-tier architecture. But it is actually under the covers, presents itself well to become a multi-tier architecture if you want to expand it. Then we'll get into Nop Data when it comes to data access. We'll touch on, again, the test coverage. And I will just touch on plugins. It kind of goes out of scope of this presentation. So when it comes to this architecture, it has a very common architecture. That's why I kind of chose it to kind of study it and kind of learn more from it. So yeah, all the kind of buzzwords out there in the .NET world are in this architecture: MVC, Entity Framework, SQL Server, Razor View Engine. So when it comes to a .NET developer, this is a great architecture to kind of review and just absorb. So as a .NET developer, you really have no excuse to even work in nopCommerce at home. I don't know if many are aware of this, but you can actually download the Visual Studio Dev Essentials, which you get Visual Studio Community Edition. I'm not a Microsoft guy at all, but the Community Edition is the Professional Edition. Unless you're a multi-million-dollar organization, you can compile and release code under the Community Edition. They changed that dramatically from what the older Community Editions of Visual Studio were. You get some Azure credits. 25 is really not enough, but you get some. Visual Studio Team Services, you get up to 5 users to have unlimited private repositories. So I know GitHub's the craze, but that's all pretty much public repositories if you want to pay for it. And I know there's Bitbucket as well, but there's a lot to offer inside of Visual Studio Team Services. And SQL Server Developer Edition. So just with all that, you pretty much have enough to really dig in deep, work with nopCommerce heavily as a developer. Another piece to this that I like a lot is that it also comes with the 3-month subscription to Pluralsight. And I'm kind of a Pluralsight junkie. I watch a lot of it. And since I can't really, in a half-hour, 20-minute time frame, I can't get into explaining all the technologies. We're going to be looking at the code of nopCommerce. I will reference certain Pluralsight courses that kind of relate to how the nopCommerce code base is structured. So you can kind of take it further of understanding MVC more, our entity framework. So back to the splash of technologies. Somehow we have to kind of organize this in a way to where it makes sense. So it's best to just kind of walk through the front end and then see how the business logic is being handled in data. So again, we'll go through the application entry points and look at the business logic and how that's managed with the different products as well as the data access layer. But we're not so much focused on the technologies, we're focused on the code. So we'll kind of more so relate it to the code base itself and how it applies to these different areas of a multi-tier architecture. And the references for nopCommerce aren't really this simple. They are pretty close. It is actually a really well-defined architecture when it comes to having like some single responsibilities, but it really, it's a little bit more cross-reference, whatnot. So data purely references when you're hitting data within the SQL Server database, but there's other types of data stores that are referenced from nopCore. And nopCore is kind of referenced by everything. So it's not real clean, but it's pretty doggone clean from most architectures that I've reviewed. So again, this is kind of a walkthrough of the whole architecture. So think of like day one on the job, you're thrown into this project, you got to use nopCommerce, you know .NET, you know C#, but you don't know nopCommerce. And here's a good 30 minutes of, here's the whole architecture end to end. Application entry points. So we'll be looking at an example with a nopWeb, we'll touch on nopAdmin as well. So when you fire up a nopWeb, you get the storefront, as you would expect, so that's a good one to keep as your startup project. The first time you run it, you get the install page. Everybody, I'm sure, has seen this if you work in nopCommerce, and I'm sure everybody had to search where the heck is my connection string to the database, and it's kind of hidden to where it's in the settings.txt. So as I go through the source code, I have looked at the 4.0 version. I will kind of mention some things I've noticed of 3.9 versus 4.0. So one in particular, those that database connection settings have moved. So just good to be aware of if you're searching for settings.txt, it is now in data settings.json. So when looking at an architecture, you might feel like you should just go right to the home page and look behind that and see how things work. The home page is great for looking at how something is containerized. So you got these widgets and actions. But it doesn't really kind of give you a sense of what's the standard flow and how a page works on the front end. So we're going to pick a different page, register page. Kind of boring, but it's an easy to follow example of the common ways of how MVC is implemented within nopCommerce. So typically when I look at a architecture, I will kind of start from the controller, just to kind of get a sense of how that, how that page was discovered. So for the register page, it came to this method, which returns a view. And then that method also instantiated that model, which passed to the view. So nothing crazy here when it comes to MVC. That's kind of what I want to point out here is when it comes to just standard practice of MVC, it's pretty easy to follow architecture. So we're going to be kind of pointing out where nopCommerce is just adding a little bit more value to this. So on the front end, we're going to look at how localization is handled as well as validation. So within the model itself, you have these different indicators, these kind of key type values that are utilized for the purpose of localization. So the model itself on the UI side is decorated with these attributes. So just looking again at this simple example, label forward, required hint are two that nopCommerce kind of overrides. So required hint is that little red asterisk up there, but that's a extension method provided by nopCommerce to show that. When it comes to validation, that validation message 4 actually utilizes a third-party product, actually an open source third-party product called Fluent Validation. We'll take a closer look at that here in a little bit. And the label 4 is actually a HTML extension that nopCommerce provides. So we're not going to dig in through the code here, but what I want to point out the most is that you can make a lot of use out of discovering, first off, how nopCommerce has implemented HTML extensions or C# extensions when it comes to Razor view pages. And in this case, it's really for the purpose of localization. Now, I will point out on the 4.0 side, this is changed to tag helpers, and that's good. In many ways, the syntax itself on the page is simply changed, but the actual flow of everything is pretty much the same. I would highly recommend if you work with, the current code base of 3.9, download 4.0, even follow these examples. Go side by side. What has changed here? For the most part, outside of the UI, not a whole lot has changed, which is kind of good. There's not so many drastic changes that have been applied. But on the UI side, yes, there have been a fair number of changes to use tag helpers switcher for the better. Oh yes, I'm sorry. And yeah, it utilizes that key value in order to figure out what exactly to show on that label. So on validation, fluent validation, it really kind of uses the link expression type syntax when it comes to how to implement validation on your UI. Let's look at examples here. So once you, of course, it's already referenced, but within the code base, if you're using that namespace, you could simply have this attribute of validator, and you give it a validator class, like the register validator. And you kind of do this once for your model instead of the normal practice. I don't say normal practice, but if you're looking at your Hello World examples on validation, you will notice that a lot of the validation pieces are on the model itself. So validation aspects are typically tied to the different properties on the model, and it's not separated from, the validation is not separated from the model. I like this separation. It provides a lot more power on testing as well. So if we dig a little deeper into the register validator, so in this example for that of that type register model, for the last name, it basically doesn't want it to be empty, and it also utilizes a localized resource when it comes to recognizing what message to exactly show here. So this is cool and all, how you can kind of have all your rules right here, but the real value of this is how you can inject data into your validator. So if you're wanting to validate stuff against like localized values, or more in particular like a list of states, how do you handle that when it comes to validation on your UI side? This kind of separation allows for this code base to be unit tested on the front end for the model side. nopAdmin. So for this talk, not to get into, but there's a lot of really good examples within nopAdmin when it comes to understanding CRUD, a lot of create, read, and update of a lot of data. Of course, it's nice that there's a standard flow to things. So customers search, and then that grid is basically Kendo UI. So I found this to be a good way to kind of dig more into not only just how CRUD is handled, but even how Kendo UI kind of latches into all this. And really the wrap up when it comes to application entry points, this was brought up in the previous talk, but Web API I kind of look at as an application entry point. It's not a UI, but it's an entry point to nopCommerce. It's an interface that you got to deal with. So I know most of this crowd is aware of this product. When I give this talk to just .NET developers, they're not aware of this. And when it comes to the idea of how you would implement Web API as a plugin is pretty cool in itself. So that's what I like about nopCommerce is that it's not just UI stuff. You can actually implement Web API just through a plugin model. Oh, nop templates, of course. So to highlight a few courses, Alex Wolf, and he's got a lot of good stuff on Pluralsight. So the MVC request lifecycle, he really does a good job on that. And I also found that he does a really good course on just when it comes to understanding the value of extension points, which again, nopCommerce makes a lot of use of. All right, here's where things get kind of fun for me, actually. So when it comes to understanding business logic, little bit of a review. So the controller basically instantiates the model. It also instantiates the view, but at the same time, it passes a reference to the view to that model. Typical MVC stuff, nothing crazy there. When it comes to the controller and how it gets to its data, it works with nop services, and it'll work with some kind of class that's typically called a service. It's called a factory, it's called a helper. It's data that nop services is managing on how to go get to it. So whatever that little thing is after that class name, they probably could all be called service, but they're kind of named in a certain way to kind of describe more of what to expect, how that service works. So the service itself populates domain entities, and that is what gets filled into the model. So that separation of the UI to the business layer is really well separated for those concerns. So dependency injection and inversion of control. I always kind of hear about this topic in some theoretical fashion. So dependency injection, when it comes down to it, we're just going to work with the constructors on how we inject data. Inversion control, it's simply a framework. We use AutoFact for the framework. enough of this stuff. Let's look at code. So we look at the customer controller. We could have looked at one of the services as well, but customer controller was a pretty good one to build off of. All these different things, services, parser, helpers, all these different things go get data in some fashion, whether it's from a database, could be a system resource, but nonetheless, these are all the things that this controller needs to go get the data. And in particular, that particular one reference, that second one, is what was utilized in that first example. Why do we do this? Why do we make it so doggone hard to get data? Who's our veteran developers? Why do we do this? It's a softball. Testability, unit testing. So, an example of that particular class, there's the one that I pulled one of the unit tests from nopCommerce. So basically, you can mock out with the interface and then provide for that test to that service, in this example, for what it needs for the thing that you're trying to test, that logic you're trying to test. So when it comes to testability and things you try to test, your business logic is the most important pieces. And if you can't abstract somehow, some way, how you're injecting data, if it's making its own database connections inside of itself, then you're not going to be able to do unit testing. Integration testing, but not unit testing. Yes, allows for controlling data. Now, in that customer controller, let's say we focused on just that address model factory, that very first one. And we wanted to, let's say, for that address model factory, that thing that's going to go get data, I went ahead and just want to create a constructor that has no parameters. I want to instantiate it in line. So I just want to kind of make it easy on developer, instantiate in line. So just that address model factory, this is me kind of coding in all the dependencies of the dependencies of the dependencies. I purposely left the database connection within the red so you can kind of see these are all different areas where a database connection would be instantiated in some fashion. Just this one had like almost 300, I really didn't think it'd go this far, but I had almost 300 dependencies, child dependencies that it needed just for that customer controller. So dependency injection is cool, and I didn't even bother to do the other ones, obviously. I just wanted to get it to compile. So dependency injection is cool for testability. However, you need something. You really need something that's going to handle the instantiation around dependency injection. They come hand in hand. So dependency injections for testability, AutoFact, an IOC container is just for your application as a whole, for the most part, to handle those instantiations. So for that particular example, when it comes to how things work with an AutoFact, you may have noticed the dependency register class, and that's what gets fired up initially to recognize what are the things that are going to need to instantiate and why. So here we go. So it's that AutoFact container builder that's getting populated at startup. And for what was done, where we had to consider those multiple aspects, is now handled in one line of code within AutoFact, given it's in the right place. So that address model factory, and we also have basically a rule around it that we only want one instance of this thing. So that's where a IOC AutoFact comes into play on managing all that. Some other aspects of AutoFact, you can basically, for some criteria of how you want to instantiate something, by a type, all controllers. So you can do in one method, look at all your assemblies in memory, and have AutoFact manage those. More commonly, when it comes to your data connections, so you can handle, of course, AutoFact is most popular in using this for database connections than probably anything else. So yes, they go hand in hand for those reasons. AutoMapper, it's a nice usage of this product inside of there, to where using extension methods, for example, on the manufacturer model, or you can return a manufacturer model by passing an entity to it. So you don't have to go through the manual if you want to keep that true separation of an entity to your model. You don't want to have to do that last name, first name, manually type work. So what AutoMapper will do for you, and AutoMapper is really just one line of code as well. So we have some nice extension methods for the different types that utilize AutoMapper under the covers. And it makes things as easy like where you go ahead and get the manufacturer from the service, and then you have a one-liner that kind of takes those settings, for how the manufacturer is populated right into the model. So glad to see that this library is being used. All right, so kind of walk through the service layer, then how that populates entities and how it populates the model, so you have this nice separation. I didn't really kind of talk about logic. Here's maybe kind of a lame example, but nonetheless an example of logic being handled. So when you delete a customer, you don't really delete a customer. It just basically tacks on a dash deleted of the email and username and just updates it. It's logic. So it's in the right spot for being in the services. And with inside of here, the entity itself is what's being passed, not the model itself. And those entities are pretty dumb. So it's good to keep out a lot of that extra business logic inside of here, keep it in your services so you can test it within there. So I like how the pattern is consistent throughout most of this architecture. So entities are pretty much like what are also called DTOs, data transfer objects. They're pretty dumb and it's good. So you're not having to find where is all the logic being managed. This is a good course. It does touch on AutoFact in one of the sections. So practical IOC, a little dated, but still good. Data access. Now, it's always good to look at the database structure. It was nice to see that nopCommerce has a pretty simple database structure to follow. A lot of systems, you don't even want to look at the database structure. But nonetheless, it was nice to kind of look at this architecture and know that nothing really crazy was going on here. Entity framework itself is an ORM, an object relational mapper. However, within nopCommerce, and I've been working with Entity Framework for a while, I haven't seen Entity Framework implemented in a solution like I have seen it implemented in nopCommerce. For better or for worse, I haven't seen it implemented this way, it's pretty cool actually. So let's just kind of jump into that. So the service, it's going to get its data through a repository. And that repository is going to use this mapper type class to populate the entity. So it really does use those domain entities for the data transfer itself. Now, a simple class, get customer ID, you see that it just kind of works with calling that method get by ID. We look a little closer at that customer repository. We see it's really just working with an interface of type customer. So I've seen this before, it's pretty generic, of a type, and it's based upon an interface, as well as that particular method is off the interface of get that customer by ID. That interface itself, iRepository, has what you would expect out of something for data access to be kind of standard. So get by ID, insert, update, delete. How you work with these different entities is, there's a standard to follow here. And it's the EF repository that implements that standard, that iRepository. So that get by ID, it's kind of fun to see comments in code of why this is done this way. So just does an entities.find on ID. But when you look a little bit closer at the EF repository, you also notice that this table is exposed with the iQueryable interface, which is actually kind of hooking right into what's exposed for this entities of IDB set. So what does this really mean now? In a different example, get customer by GUID, to where you have now the criteria in the services layer. So a lot of times you'll want to keep this kind of, whatever that criteria is of that select statement, you're going to want to keep that possibly in the repository itself. However, Entity Framework is worked with as an abstraction. So you have this ORM that's an abstraction itself already on top of the database structure, but Entity Framework is an abstraction into the service layer. So when it comes to putting logic of this search criteria in your service layer, well, yeah, you can do that because Entity Framework accommodates those interfaces to where you can put criteria into the service layer. Some people would totally disagree with this because of database performance, those kinds of aspects, but it's a pretty cool abstraction of an ORM to where you can manage your logic inside services and not in the repository. Oh yeah, sorry. Should have highlighted that. All right, so the repository basically just works with this mapper class, in which, as an example, the customer, so kind of putting that metadata on top of the customer for it to only have 400 characters in length. That's really not a nopCommerce aspect. That's really an ND framework aspect where you kind of get this fluent approach to putting metadata around your entities. So this is how it gets populated. All right, there's so many other aspects when it comes to data access. It's totally out of scope here, but it comes to how I think image files are handled, configuration management, the cloud solution, as well as Redis. There's a lot more to be discovered here. ND framework in the enterprise has this domain architecture that it kind of uses as its basis, which is really close to how things are structured in nopCommerce. So it's worth checking out if you want to dive deeper into ND framework and how it's applied. Test coverage, how are we doing on time? 7 minutes? Oh, we're good. Oh, we're good. All right. So this is kind of fun. Test coverage. So first off, when managers come to you and say, well, why don't we have more unit coverage? Why aren't you writing unit tests? Well, for nopCommerce, you kind of have no excuse because it's a pretty good architecture for managing unit tests. But when it comes to testing in general, there's really 3 different ways you think of testing under probably a unit test type platform. So there's functional testing, which is your UI testing. Selenium's a popular tool for that. Test Stack is something I'm digging into personally more. That provides a nice abstraction on top of Selenium for web apps, as well as hooks into desktop apps as well, as a nice object model to work with. It's open source too. Integration testing. So if you're hitting data of any kind, you're hitting, of course, your database, file system resources, date time's data. if you're checking date time in your service, like date time now, how are you going to test that? So that's an integration test. Think of your code as if it needs data of any kind, whether it's in a database or the system has it up in memory, it becomes an integration test right away. And that's where unit testing, true unit testing, is where you're injecting that somehow, some way. And we saw that example earlier. So nopCommerce, for the most part, is within its testing, has a lot of unit tests within it. So an example of that test, it uses NUnit. So you got the test fixture, which is kind of what to expect. You have these different, for example, repositories that would be used later on. They kind of get set up or utilized or instantiated within setup. So kind of what you expect when it comes to looking at the different test classes. One aspect that kind of stood out for me, I didn't really think of doing this myself on other projects, is that I was expecting to see an assert at the bottom of this test. And we see this should equal, which is actually utilizing some test extensions. So you can put more standards around your unit test by encapsulating some things that are pretty redundant. So even something as simple as the should equals was kind of cool to discover. So you're not doing assert everywhere. And you could probably put more other handling in there as well if you wanted to. So another aspect. Oh, okay. All right, I'm going to wrap this up. So here, I was going to jump ahead. You do need this test adapter to get the Visual Studio integration. And test coverage itself, if you just run out of the box, just compile it, run, you're going to get some failed tests. And I'll just kind of pop through these really quick. So this is what I call opportunity to help test coverage. And a lot of times when you see something, even though it's 90%, 96% covered, you really should look closer at what those tests are really digging into. All right. Can I go and plug my talk for tonight? All right, well, I'm going to be at the social tonight. I love talking about this stuff, period. Catch me in the hallways. Again, email me at john@johnbaluka.com. I'm going to at least jump to that slide at the very end. Da-da-da. And eventually get there. There we go. So the content itself, I'll give you a recording of this presentation. You can see more about the test coverage, the test on extensibility. And I also share more of what I'm doing with nopCommerce. I'm actually in the process of creating some Pluralsight content that nopCommerce is the basis of. And I'm kind of like using that as the example of what if we took out Razor and put in Angular? What would that look like? What if we took out, instead of Angular, we use React or Vue, whatever that flavor of the day is. There's going to be more content. So far, Pluralsight is who I'm working with. Might go to Udemy. I hear that's a little better to go work with. But nonetheless, that's it. Thanks, guys.